Hi there! Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. The Institute offers NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NeuroAffective Relational Model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving C-PTSD, addressing attachment, developmental, relational, and intergenerational trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. I am a psychotherapist in Chicago, and currently I happen to be a NARM student, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about what you can expect if you come to listen to further episodes of this podcast. We are here to expand the conversation about complex trauma, and we specifically want to talk about the shifts that can happen when someone experiences healing and then begins to connect to their sense of post-traumatic growth. So I was just doing a little Googling on the interwebs, as I am wont to do when there's something I want to learn more about. And I was thinking, is post-traumatic growth the same thing as resiliency? And apparently not, my friends. It is not the same thing. When I Googled post-traumatic growth, one of the first things that pops up is something from the APA. There is a quote on there by a person named Kanako Taku, PhD, an associate professor of psychology at Oakland University. And the quote is, "Resiliency is the personal attribute or ability to bounce back. Post-traumatic growth, on the other hand, refers to what can happen when someone who has difficulty bouncing back experiences a traumatic event that challenges their core beliefs, endures psychological struggle, even a mental illness such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and then ultimately finds a sense of personal growth. It's a process that takes a lot of time, energy, and struggle. And apparently there's also a post-traumatic growth inventory, which then includes appreciation of life, relationships with others, new possibilities in life, personal strength, and spiritual change." So I think that really speaks to a lot of the NARM philosophy that you'll be hearing about in future episodes. This podcast is sponsored by the NARM Training Institute, so I do have to tell you a little bit about NARM. It's called the NeuroAffective Relational Model, and it was developed by Dr. Laurence Heller. I guess before I get into it, I do want to say I'm definitely trying to not be too jargony, and also keep in mind that all of the guests that we're going to be interviewing are part of the NARM community, and so it can be helpful to understand a little bit more about what this model is. So here is a quote from Dr. Heller's book, Healing Developmental Trauma. "The spontaneous movement in all of us towards connection, health, and aliveness. No matter how withdrawn or isolated we have become, on the deepest level, just as a plant spontaneously moves towards sunlight, there is in each of us an impulse toward connection and healing." And so that is one of the foundational tenets of NARM, is that everyone wants to move towards connection and healing. And I think it can be so frustrating sometimes, even for therapists. We go into this work because we believe that people can heal. And when we see people thwart their own progress and their own healing, we can become really discouraged. But this model has been such a great reframe for me to continue to remind myself that even if somebody presents in a way that doesn't look like they're moving towards healing, it's in there. That light is definitely in there. It is also what we're calling a top-down and bottom-up approach. Bottom-up approaches, you may have heard that term related to somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy. And essentially, bottom-up approaches are getting at the soma. They're getting at the body level. And oftentimes those are really about potentially completing a movement that has not been completed. It was thwarted in the midst of a trauma that happened. And then top-down is talk therapy. And NARM really combines a psychodynamic style of therapy, which is very much all about the relationship and all about the present moment. So it combines psychodynamic with somatic work, and then is simultaneously a top-down and bottom-up approach. As I said in that initial quote, talking about moving towards connection, one of the things that we try to do as NARM therapists is be aware of connection and disconnection, and expansion and contraction. When is a person connected to themselves, and when are they disconnected from themselves? And then also, when are they expanding maybe into this core self, and when do they contract away from that? Finally, there are what Larry calls survival styles. that are really born out of early relationships. So essentially, if we are in a family where we are having this chronic and constant misattunement, we have to figure out a way to take care of ourselves and survive in that environment. And so instead of pathologizing or essentially kind of judging, right? I am an addiction therapist, so I think addiction is a really easy way to describe this. If I think about some of my clients who experienced trauma in their childhood, it totally makes sense to me why in their teenage years, or even sometimes younger than that, they begin using drugs and alcohol. Because if I were experiencing the trauma that some of my clients experienced, I would probably want to get out of my body too and not have those experiences. And so instead of saying like, oh, addiction is bad and you shouldn't be doing that, giving space for these survival strategies to make sense and appreciating the wisdom is really what the model hopes to do, so that it can, again, help kind of create space for alleviating the shame that comes with a lot of these survival strategies. So I'm sitting here with Brad Kammer, and Brad is the lead trainer in the U.S. for the NARM training program. And we wanted to just bring him on here to have a little chat briefly, to introduce himself and to talk about, his passion for this work with C-PTSD. So Brad, hi, welcome.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. I'm so happy that we're launching this podcast. I'm so happy to be part of it and so happy that you're spearheading it. So thank you so much.
Spearhead. That sounds like pressure, but that's a whole nother thing.
Well, so happy that you're hosting it. You have such a great presence and your podcast has been such an inspiration for people. And so I'm really excited that you're helping us with getting more of the understanding of complex trauma and specifically about NARM out there.
Well, thank you. It is my pleasure. So Brad, I know you wanted to add a little bit of historical context to this. Do you want to share what you were thinking?
Yeah, it seems really important just for understanding where we are in the field of trauma right now. Because back in 1992, there was this really important, influential book in the psychology world called Trauma and Recovery by Dr. Judith Herman.
Mm-hmm.
And that really revolutionized kind of this understanding of trauma. And particularly, she has a chapter 6 in the book. It's called A New Diagnosis. And she introduces this concept of complex post-traumatic stress disorder that is differentiated from PTSD, which is more specifically focused for people that have been combat veterans, assault survivors, people in accidents, more what we might refer to as shock trauma events. So back in 1992, she was really championing this idea of a new diagnosis that would help us understand more complexity around trauma. And here we are, we still don't have an official diagnosis. And so one of my hopes about this podcast and about the NARM Training Institute and just about our role in this field of trauma-informed care is that we can pick up this momentum that has been stalled by all the different challenges in our field and in the world, and really help to bring this full circle to where we have a diagnosis that's really going to fit people, particularly children, but also adults that are struggling and getting all these other diagnoses, and helping people normalize this understanding for themselves that it's actually not the event or the situations that happen to them that's really the issue anymore as they get older, but it's how we've had to learn how to adjust and adapt to that. And that's where this complex PTSD diagnosis really comes in handy. And, in NARM, that's what this model is designed for. It's designed for working with people that have experienced and are still dealing and living with unresolved complex trauma. That's where NARM fits in. That's where I really come in, because that's my passion of really understanding complex trauma and working both with event trauma or shock trauma, which relates more to PTSD, and then more relational trauma, environmental trauma, intergenerational trauma, and that relates to more complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So just, really excited about, being an educator out there, helping bring awareness and helping clinicians be trained in a model that's effective for specifically working with C-PTSD, and just positioning all of us as clinicians so that when this diagnosis becomes official, which it isn't yet in North America, that we'll be ready with effective treatment to work with all the clients that are coming in with a lot of unresolved trauma.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, since I've started getting the training in NARM, I'm just hearing it everywhere with every client, with every interaction that I have with people, and realizing what a hole we've had in the way that we're able to treat this, because really everybody suffers from some sort of developmental injury or trauma.
Exactly. Yeah. And, Oprah Winfrey right now is, this is one of her big causes that she got turned on to this understanding of complex or developmental trauma and the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And she's doing a lot of initiatives right now in terms of helping bring more to the awareness of how important it is for us to recognize, starting from the very beginning with children and families and communities, that there's so much unresolved developmental trauma that hasn't been addressed. And when it's not going addressed, it has implications not just for our own psychological health, but all our physical health, our communities, and social violence, and even larger, in terms of all the conflicts that are happening around the world. So it's just such a huge thing. And, I just am working at a very small sliver of it in terms of working with clinicians, but my passion is that people go out into the world and are using this information to then make impact with their clients, the families they're working with, the communities they're working with, even public policy, bringing it into schools, hospitals, just so many areas that this information and this treatment can really be effective and supportive. And so, I'm kind of a grassroots person. That's my background. I worked in humanitarian aid and, been a political activist. And so I'm just really passionate about getting this work, making it accessible for people so that we can actually start to deal with something that's at the root of so many of the problems that we're dealing with in our world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For folks listening to this podcast, what are you really hoping happens with this podcast? What do you really want to see?
Well, first of all, I'm just really excited that people are tuning in and listening. I'm a podcast junkie, and so I always am searching new topics.
Same.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm always searching new topics. And, if you've just been turned on to this topic, we welcome you. And, the word trauma is a big word. It scares a lot of people off. But I think, as you start to hear us kind of break that apart and help to define it more clearly, you'll see that it really relates to so much in our life. It's not this huge thing that comes one day and changes the rest of your life. It's actually a lot of things that we've just learned to adjust to. And, the adjustment was important so that we could continue moving forward, but there's cost to it. The costs are that our lives are not as healthy or happy or fulfilled. And we're really wanting to bring this message. In our field, it's called post-traumatic growth, which is the idea that you can learn ways of relating to yourself, relating to your trauma, relating to the relationships you have in your life that can actually use what you've been through to create greater sense of strength, resiliency, health, intimacy, creativity. And we hope that by listening to some of the people that are in our field working with complex trauma, specifically working with the NARM approach, you're going to hear a lot of different tips and a lot of different perspectives and hopefully a lot of moments of inspiration that might help you in your life. And for those of you that are interested in learning more, we hope that you might join us in learning more in the different online and live programs we have, because we're really trying to build a community here of like-minded people that are working to resolve the complex trauma that's at the root of so many of our problems.
Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to share that we haven't talked about yet?
You've already talked about that. One of the challenges that you're going to have and that we're going to have with this podcast is that we are talking about very sophisticated, kind of nuanced psychological concepts. And our intention is really to make it accessible for everyone. And so, I'm really excited, Sarah, about how well you do it at breaking that down and making it available for people to understand, even if you don't have a psychological background. So for those of you that are listening to this podcast and that's not your background, we're going to do the best we can to really make it accessible so that you can take what you're hearing from us and apply it to your life and apply it to the world around you. That's really our intention. We want this to be a bridge for helping us connect. There's just so many people out there that really need this work. And so hopefully you get excited about listening to what Sarah and all the other people that are going to be on this podcast are talking about, and then be able to bring it to your relationships and your communities.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure folks are going to be excited to hear more from you in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to jumping in with you every once in a while, and just really excited for what you're bringing for everyone here. So thank you so much.
So, who is this podcast for? This podcast is for everyone. I mean, come on, who doesn't love podcasts? But specifically, we really want to, like I said, expand this conversation about complex trauma. And so if you are a person who finds yourself interested in such topics, you are welcome here. We definitely want this to be accessible to therapists and students, people who are getting trained in the mental health field. But we also want this to be available to anyone who has an interest in trauma or healing from trauma. And so what I'm going to try to do in this podcast is really be mindful of the language that we use so that this can really be accessible. So I'm going to do my best to break down some clinical terms so that it doesn't feel so daunting and that a person who hasn't had a master's degree in mental health can also participate in this. I've already said the term complex trauma a couple of times, and I figure it's probably really important to unpack that and really define what it is from the perspective that we'll be sharing with this podcast. Complex trauma is the result of significant and chronic misattunement from caregivers, which then produces shame. That shame and the attempts to avoid the shame affect psychological and physiological functions and disrupts the development of a core self or personality. So what does that mean? Significant and chronic misattunement from caregivers. So misattunement is essentially the experience of not being gotten. You are not got, essentially not being understood, right? One of the things I experienced as a child was, if I were feeling sad about something, one of the things that my mom tried to do to help me feel better was she would try to cheer me up, or she would try to say to look on the bright side. But for me, that was actually an experience of misattunement, because what I really needed in those moments was to actually have her say something like, oh, it's okay to be sad, or of course you're feeling sad about this. So that is a little example of what misattunement can look like. And then dysregulation of psychological and physiological symptoms. So when I say I feel dysregulated physiologically, usually there's an experience of hypo or hyper arousal in the nervous system, right? So the nervous system, it gives you that fight, flight, or freeze response, essentially. And so if I'm feeling hyper aroused, which is usually what happens to me, it's almost like internally like this caffeinated feeling and a physical feeling of anxiety, like things are like running too quickly. And that's something that happens to me physiologically. And then hypoarousal would be more about like, collapse or not being able to move and feeling very sluggish, physically depressed. So that's kind of the dysregulation of physiological symptoms. And then emotional dysregulation, the way I like to describe it to my clients is that they're like overfeelers and underfeelers, and I'm an overfeeler. So when I feel feelings, they are very big, they are very present. I am so aware of them that I could not possibly hide from them. And then the underfeelers, so you can kind of see how this is like the hyper arousal, but in terms of emotions, basically like whether the volume is turned up or the volume is turned down. And then talking about this core self or personality, essentially the hope, I guess, is for all humans is that we can be the most authentic version of ourselves. And there is no one authentic self. This model can be really hard to talk about because there's so many nuanced ideas that I feel like sometimes my human brain doesn't really quite wrap itself all the way around. But essentially, our personality, our core self, I always just like to think of like the best version of myself when I'm not driven by my ego, when I'm driven by something that feels greater than myself. That's usually when I'm actually connected to my best self. The term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I feel like is a term that is pretty widely used, I guess, in the general vernacular. And what we really want to focus on in this podcast is C-PTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which at the time we're recording this, it is not an official diagnosis yet in the ICD or the DSM, which those are essentially the diagnostical manuals for either medical or for mental health disorders. So I want to differentiate for folks what the difference between PTSD and C-PTSD is. PTSD essentially has three components: a sense of threat, avoidance of that threat, and re-experiencing. And re-experiencing might be intrusive thoughts or nightmares or compulsive overthinking about a situation. And PTSD often involves a life-threatening situation. Complex PTSD, on the other hand, it has those first three elements: sense of threat, avoidance, re-experiencing, and then it has an additional three, which is interpersonal disturbances, negative self-concept, and affect dysregulation. Interpersonal disturbances essentially just means issues in relationships, and then negative self-concept, that's pretty self-explanatory, and then affect dysregulation is sort of what I was talking about earlier with this kind of turning the volume up on certain emotions or turning them down. So turning the volume up and feeling more out of control, or turning the volume down and feeling like you don't necessarily even have access to those emotions. That is the difference between PTSD and C-PTSD. We will be continuing to say the word trauma. We're going to keep talking about trauma. And I guess it's important to highlight why is it so important to talk about trauma and have these conversations. And one really great example is the ACEs study, so Adverse Childhood Experiences. And a doctor named Vincent Felitti, he did a study with Kaiser Permanente that was actually all about weight loss. So initially it had nothing to do with trauma. Essentially, there were folks who were part of the study who were losing hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and then they would get really close to their goal and would essentially either self-sabotage or they would backtrack and regain the weight. And what Dr. Felitti found was that the folks who would get up to a certain point in their goal and then not be able to move past that, all of those folks had in common experiences of trauma in their childhoods. And so then the study shifted to really recognize what is the impact of trauma on adults later in life. A couple things that he found is trauma is way more common than the general population would like to think. It's funny, I actually had a therapist fairly recently say like, oh, I think we're overusing the word trauma. And I said, oh, I totally disagree. I think we're underusing the term trauma. I think we just need to define it better as a society. So trauma is more common than we think. Trauma is the underlying cause of most, if not all, psychological disorders. I actually read an article recently that was talking about our use of psychopharmacology, essentially over-relying on drugs to quote unquote cure depression or anxiety and those sorts of things. And what's interesting is we know that anxiety and depression create changes in the brain. And one of the things that NARM looks at and other models that are looking at complex trauma, what essentially we're finding is that the trauma changes the brain. And so the curiosity is, if we can heal the underlying trauma, what then changes with these psychological disorders that we're seeing? Another piece of this is trauma is also underlying a multitude of physiological disorders. So with the ACEs study, autoimmune disorders for sure, certain types of cancer for sure, people are more prone to if they've experienced trauma, because it definitely activates the fight or flight system. And then there's cortisol in the system, and cortisol is not great if you have a ton of it flooding in your system. And so that creates problems with physiology. So actual health problems can relate from this. And then finally, the most important thing for this podcast in particular is that it is possible to find healing and thrive after experiencing trauma. We see that time and time again with our clients. And for those of us who are going through the training and doing our own trauma work at the same time, we can attest that that is true. So it's a hard model to describe, a really hard model to describe. It's very complex. It's very nuanced, so challenging to break down into neat little sound bites. I hope that the model will become more clear for you through discussions with NARM therapists and using NARM to address complex trauma. But please reach out to us. We invite you to engage with us with questions or anything and everything. And we really, really hope to connect with you on that. I also wanted to mention before we end, both Brad and Dr. Heller, who you will also hear us all refer to as Larry, have been on a bunch of podcasts themselves. And so if you want to hear more from them specifically, definitely check that out. So Brad's been on Pure Curiosity, The Addicted Mind, The Trauma Therapist Project, and a little podcast called Conversations with a Wounded Healer that I happen to also host. And then Larry's also been on the Trauma Therapist Project and Conversations with a Wounded Healer. So we'll make sure to link those in the show notes so that you can check them out. Well, I think that does it for our intro episode. I hope that gives you a pretty decent picture of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and the ways that NARM can help people move through and transform and heal. Thank you so much for listening, and we really are excited to share this with the world and hope that you will continue to join us on this journey. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, which is an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, and thank you to Tori Essex for our album art. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.